All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the final Wilson Library Research Forum of this season. My name is Jason Tomberlin, Head of Research and Instructional Services here at the Wilson Special Collections Library. Those of you logging in hoping to see Matt Turry, he is on vacation, and so I'm doing this for him today. We are very happy to have two speakers with us today, and they will be, I'll introduce them in just a few seconds, but the forum is an opportunity for those gathered here today to hear from some of our Wilson Library Research Fellows, hear from the recipients, talk about their research, talk about the material that they've been using here in Wilson Special Collections Library. And as one of the individuals that pages a lot of these boxes and books, it's always fantastic to hear about the research that's going on here at Wilson Library. So we're very excited to have these two individuals with us today. We'll have two speakers, Huntley Hughes and Eric Bontempo. They're both going to have about 20 minutes. And then we'll leave about 15 minutes at the very end of this presentation for question and answer. You're welcome to put your questions into the chat. I'll be monitoring that and kind of saving them. But please do hold your questions. You can go ahead and put them in there, but we'll do a Q&A at the very end of this session. For those of you who would prefer to ask your questions out loud, just unmute yourself, raise your hand. And then you can ask a question, perhaps a more nuanced way. I'd like to, as I mentioned, Matt Turry, I'd like to thank Matt Turry and Nadia Clifton for organizing and coordinating these research forums, our colleagues in library communications for sending out invitations, and colleagues across the university library system for their help and support in getting research and resources for these fellows. I'll start with introducing Huntley Hughes. Huntley is a recipient of the Southern Studies Pre-Dissertation Prospectus Fellowship, which is funded by the Watson Brown Foundation. He is a fourth-year doctoral candidate and instructor at Vanderbilt University, whose research interests include the Southern Gothic and literary representations of the displacement of agricultural workers and developmentalist narratives in the 20th century United States. The title of his talk today will be Unions, Cooperatives, and the Social Gospel in the American South. Our second speaker is Eric Bontempo. He is a recipient of the rare book collection Haynes Graduate Fellowship. Eric is a PhD candidate here at UNC Chapel Hill in the Department of English and Comparative Literature. His research interests include poetry, religion, and secularization in the long 19th century. Eric is working on the dissertation entitled Portable Piety, How Victorian Devotional Poetry Anthologies Repurpose Romanticism. The title of his talk today will be The Devotional Wordsworth, Repurposing William Wordsworth into Victorian Devotional Poetry Anthologies. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Huntley. And again, we'll have a Q&A session at the end, and we look forward to the presentations.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Jason. And thank you, Eric, for also sharing your work. And thank you to everyone who could show up today. I really appreciate it. Let me go ahead and share my screen so that you can see some of the materials that I have been working with at the Wilson Library. Now, is that available to everybody? Fantastic. Like Jason said, I am Huntley Hughes, and I am in the English department at Vanderbilt. And being in the English department, this was my first real foray into longer term kind of archival research. So I didn't really know if I was doing it right the entire time, which was part of the fun, actually, because it led into some extremely interesting research directions that were not what I anticipated. I'm not sure if that's generally the case when one does archival work, but I went down all of these interesting rabbit holes that ended up being far more productive than what I had originally planned doing. So I guess to begin, I'll tell you a little bit about some of the materials that I used. My primary research materials were organized around the Southern Tenant Farmers Union and the biographies and papers of some of the organizers who worked in that movement, as well as the Textile Workers Union of America, and some work on the interrelated Delta and Providence cooperative farms, which emerged from the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, and which I will tell you a little bit about as we move forward. I should also mention the papers from Jacqueline Dodd Howe's Like a Family, the kind of manuscripts of which are in the Wilson Library and which would have never gotten written in the first place if it weren't for the oral narratives that were collected there in the Wilson Library. So I'm doubly in debt to the archives for that excellent book and for giving me access to a lot of really fascinating photographs and histories and things. I also had a chance to look at some of the papers and manuscripts and letters of some kind of Marxist inclined intellectuals and activists, as well as some grassroots organizations and unionization pushes that are mentioned here on this page. So I want to begin with talking a little bit about the chapter that I was working on as I was doing my research for Wilson Library. I was interested in these kind of differing visions of futurity in Southern Gothic texts. And although I know Zora Neale Hurston is not usually considered Southern Gothic, that is part of my argument ultimately, but I'll bracket the literary for the time being so I can focus on the historical elements of this that the Wilson Library Fellowship was so helpful for. Caldwell is generally read as kind of a eugenics-inclined proto-Stalinist who's interested in the elimination of rural, backwards undesirables. And so is interested in the kind of shuffling of the rural proletariat into urban centers, mill towns especially, where they would somehow develop class consciousness and therefore create, a revolutionary movement or a worker state. And this was kind of the direction that I was looking at him when I began the project here at Wilson Library. Whereas in terms of Their Eyes Were Watching God, what I was curious about was not the kind of bucolic image of Southern workers and Southern agricultural workers that is often associated with Hurston, but rather kind of the hypermodernity of workers living on the muck and what would develop into agro-industrial kind of practices. So different kind of conceptions of what happens to rural workers in the South as the region begins to be industrialized. So that being said, I thought I was going to be spending a lot of time looking at the transition from rural work into mill work in this kind of like a family style vein of workers being pushed into industry and then kind of developing ties with socialist or communist parties, of doing grassroots organization, of staging walkouts, a kind of typically, and I admit now in retrospect, somewhat uncreatively urban focused perspective on industrialization. However, I found something very interesting as I was digging through all these papers. You can see in the top left-hand corner of the screen here, this Rural America magazine that I was unaware existed until I came to Wilson Library, and then I actually did not find in Erskine Caldwell's papers, but rather in those of the Delta Cooperative Farm, which I was just kind of exploring by chance because it sounded interesting to me. And in this publication, this nonfiction publication of Tenant Farmer by Erskine Caldwell, in this piece, I found a very, very different version of the author than what's usually represented in his fiction. It was not a kind of scoffing at the backwardsness of the rural poor. It, in fact, directly undermined the idea of eugenics as a solution to the problems of poverty in the United States. It was a text that was far more sympathetic, and I think helped take Caldwell from kind of a villainous figure for me into one that was really more misunderstood, if misguided, right? This idea that Caldwell was actually interested in a really, really kind of orthodox teleological form of dialectical materialism or historical materialism applied to his native region, the South. So this both rescued Caldwell a little bit for me and was a major indictment of the kind of teleology of orthodox Marxism. So I think this did a lot for changing the direction of my project. It took something that was a kind of uninteresting binary between like a good text and a bad text, right? And became more of a conversation that was illuminated by the multifacetedness of the different writings that I wouldn't have been exposed to otherwise. I also learned that at the time, Tobacco Road and Gods of the Laker, his two most famous novels, were in fact read alongside The Grapes of Wrath as really progressive pieces of kind of proletariat fiction of the South, right? Like pieces that were attempting, in his own words, to illuminate a kind of poverty that existed that most people, especially in urban areas, were entirely unaware of. You can see in the top right-hand corner here, and this is from the Mill Workers Union papers, stuff about the Tobacco Road in the North, right? Tobacco Road became a byword for raising awareness of poverty, which was something that has been largely ignored in the scholarship, and that was extremely helpful to find in these historical documents. As I mentioned, I was moving from a more mill-focused organization into a more mill-focused orientation towards a concern with union pushes in rural areas, which I knew very, very little about before I got to Wilson Library. I had never really heard of, for example, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. I had worked some with the Alabama Sharecroppers Union. If you've ever read All God's Dangers, the autobiography of Nate Shaw, who was an organizer within the Alabama Sharecroppers Union, you know that this was an extremely radical, occasionally violent, communist-backed organization of Black sharecroppers in the South. What I didn't know was that simultaneously, there was a group, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, which was socialist-backed, which was more progressive than radical, and which was staffed at its core almost entirely by preachers or at least religious lay people who were interested in this idea of radicalizing the gospel in the South as a means of getting some worker dignity, of creating new kind of forms of land distribution, and of trying to attempt to alleviate some of the poverty that was rampant in the region. What was of special interest to me, which is something I didn't expect to find in the archives, was all of the kind of human interaction between these two groups, which were very separate in my mind. For example, that's H.L. Mitchell, the founder of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, who was in fact shot by one of the members of the Alabama Sharecroppers Union for kind of lack of radicalism. Something I didn't expect from the archives was all of these kind of very, very human interconnections that I discovered through these papers and biographies, and the kind of proximity to these different groups to one another that was really, really powerful, at least for me, to make me feel as though I had some kind of emotional stake in what was going on, right? It took a very somewhat abstract, perhaps anemic kind of understanding of what was happening with these union pushes in the South, and made them feel very real and very personal through kind of getting to know these people through their own writings. Perhaps most interesting, I might even say inspiring to me, was learning about these members of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, who I'd never heard of before, but who ended up being, to my mind, kind of these quiet heroes of, progressive kind of labor politics in the 1930s. H.L. Mitchell, who I mentioned before, is especially important in that group as a co-founder, but also this preacher, Howard Keister, who wrote Revolt Among the Sharecroppers and dedicated his life in, like I said, kind of small, quiet ways to trying to change the mindset of workers in the South to work for themselves, and to incorporate these kind of ideas of Christian morality into their day-to-day lives from a pretty radical economic perspective. I think this is really, like I said, a kind of quietly heroic group. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the human side, like I said, of the Delta and cooperative farms in particular. Once again, I had never heard of these. I kind of found my way there from the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. And the idea was there was this displacement of workers who were striking in Arkansas. So a rich kind of group of patrons from the North and South bought a piece of land to have an experimental interracial cooperative farm to try to employ some of these socialistic leaning ideas of labor and economic organization on a small scale to see what would happen. and so you get to trace, many, many years of the farm. And one of the most interesting things about it were these kind of typewritten distributed newsletters that were going out once a week and included everything from updates on new members to work assignments to, for example, this poem written by a small girl on Delta Cooperative Farm as an ode to her turtle, Toodle Woodle. I think you can see that, and it comes with an illustration as well. And my very favorite piece of writing, I think I found while I was doing my research there, was this memoriam for Tobe the mule, which I'll read for you because the letters are kind of small. And one of the fascinating things about this is I'm going through letters and I'm going through financial documents, and there's this big catastrophe when Tobe the mule dies, because that was a huge piece of infrastructure for the farm. Like, he was really necessary to getting the ground plowed and the work done and things hauled. And so, I'm reading through this catastrophe, and it's like all in economic terms and what's going to happen. How are we going to get going? And then a few pages later, I come through this really sweet little poem that someone had written, which, like I said, really humanized this experience for me. You can see there's a little illustration there, and it says, "Oh, weep for Tobe, for he is dead. Weep now and hang your sorrowful head. Tobe, we have not been the same since you received your heavenly mane. You are sweet and faithful, and the cooperative farm is grateful. We will miss you sadly, Tobe, and hope you wear a kingly robe. May all the mules that ever die help you start co-ops in the sky." And I like Tobe so much that I, in fact, have a Tobe tattoo now. So Wilson Library has imprinted itself not only on my intellectual work, but also on my corporeal body as well. The thing I want to leave you with here is something that I think is kind of metaphorically powerful. I am in the English department, so I delight in drawing rhetorical connections where perhaps they don't exist. About the relationship of the social gospel and cooperative labor here. And I'm going to play you a quick video. You can see that sandwiched between two papers here are some handwritten notes. And I'll let you see for yourself, but I want to point out that the first paper is a handout of some kind. They did a lot of choral singing, as labor groups were like to do in the 30s, and incorporated religious tunes, which would be common to most people, as well as religious themes with lyrics about poverty and the disenfranchisement of the agricultural worker. So on the front, you see one of these handouts for a song. And on the back, you see a litany for human brotherhood, which I think really emphasizes the kind of synthesis of socialistic thinking and the Christian gospel in this piece. But what's most fascinating is what comes in the middle. And I will play this for you now. If you can see, this is someone had used this for scrap paper to take up notes on who was going to be doing particular kinds of work that day. So on the one hand is this kind of religious labor hymn, and on the other side, plowing and cleaning house in the garden and hauling wood in somebody's handwriting. And this, once again, I think really emphasizes the humanness of these projects. So kind of stuck right there in the middle of things, in a place you'd never find it otherwise, was this moment of not only real human kind of interest, but also the direct combination of both labor and this kind of social movement that I was interested in learning more about while I was here. And so before I go, I would like to give a special thanks to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, to the Wilson Library Collection staff, especially Matt Turry and Taylor DeClerc, who are both extremely helpful as I was doing my research and guiding me to find important and productive pieces of historical documents. I want to thank our event organizers, Nadia Clifton and Jason Tomberlin, for moderating. And I especially want to thank all the fellow researchers that I met while I was there at UNC, who had lunch with me and shared their work with me, and who, got excited with me over the various things that we were doing, and who were very nice in general. And lastly, if you would like to contact me or have any questions after the forum is over, it's huntley.w.hughes@vanderbilt.edu, and I would be terribly excited to talk about any more of this with anybody who is interested. So I think I have about 3 minutes left over, which is good news because we can incorporate that into the questions and answers segments. And I will move on, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from Eric shortly.
All right. Thank you very much, Huntley. Fantastic presentation. We'll now transition to Eric Bontempo. And just a reminder, the title of his talk is the Devotional Wordsworth, Repurposing William Wordsworth in Victorian Devotional Poetry Anthologies. And again, at the end of Eric's presentation, we'll have a time for question and answer, and you can put those into the chat or raise your hand when we enter that section. So good luck, Eric.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all so much. Really happy to be here. Huntley, that was a fascinating presentation. I'm from Arkansas, and it was great to get kind of a new angle on some Arkansas history. I don't remember learning about this topic in school, and I think this is a topic that maybe needs more attention. So thank you for that. I also, before I share my screen and share my PowerPoint, want to thank the entire Wilson Library staff. I had a great time as the Haynes Fellow several semesters ago, and I want to thank you all for letting me be the guinea pig whenever Wilson was slowly starting to open up. I remember being kind of like one of the first to kind of get to go back into the special collections room, and it was always an adventure to kind of enter in the side door, and I felt like a spy, kind of getting to sneak into the room and have the space to myself for a while there. And I want to thank Taylor and Matt for all their help coordinating that. I also want to thank Liz Ott, who I met with years ago. Gene Moskal introduced us, and Liz, you introduced me to the Wordsworth collection. You pointed me towards Mark Reed's bibliography, which helped me to kind of get started conceptualizing my dissertation project. And the Wordsworth collection has just been so helpful to my time here at UNC. So I'm very indebted to everyone at Wilson. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. All right, everyone should be able to see my screen. The title of my talk is The Devotional Wordsworth, Repurposing William Wordsworth in Victorian Devotional Poetry Anthologies. And I'm interested in Wordsworth's reception in the Victorian period. He was a poet, he was poet laureate. He was somebody who held very, very tightly to his poetry, really tried to control his copyright. And despite all of his efforts, his poetry would constantly get reprinted in anthologies and periodicals and newspapers. And I think over time, his poetry started to do things that Wordsworth never intended, and he probably would not have endorsed. And his transformation into a devotional poet in the Victorian period is one of those occurrences that I don't think Wordsworth intended nor endorsed, but it happened nonetheless. And I got interested in this issue because I think it can help us to understand Victorian religious culture, and it can also understand why Wordsworth is important to us today in the classroom setting and academia in general. Before I look at some specific devotional poetry anthologies, I want to show you my personal favorite item in the Wordsworth collection. And it's also a great example of Wordsworth being repurposed in the Victorian period. This is a Christmas card made in 1887. I just find it very beautiful. It's wonderfully crafted. You can kind of see some of the details on the left with the gold kind of cover, the beautiful illustration, the yarn and the kind of twine that kind of holds it all together. It's really, really beautifully made. And it's a Christmas card of a Wordsworth poem called We Are Seven. And if you know We Are Seven, if you studied it in school, you should kind of know off the bat that it is not a Christmas poem. And it's really curious why it becomes a Christmas poem. And yeah, it's something that I was trying to figure out and puzzling over. And I think that the material aspects of this Christmas card completely changes Wordsworth's poem, We Are Seven. The paratext, the illustrations, the frontispiece, this epigraph at the top left corner here helps to kind of reframe Wordsworth's poem so that it does something kind of new in the world. And again, this poem was written in 1798, and it's remade into a Christmas card, however many years later, nearly a century later in 1887. And it's printed in America, it's printed in England, it's got some good circulation there. But the one question I wanted to ask about this Christmas card is it really by Wordsworth like the title page says? Wordsworth has been dead for over 30 years at this point. And so that's a critical question, is like, who has authorship of this Christmas card? Is it Wordsworth or is it the illustrator? Is it the publisher? These are some questions that I wanted to investigate. Before the poem even begins, there are these illustrations of the main character of Wordsworth's poem, the little cottage girl. And here, there's not very much of a Christmas theme in any of these illustrations or in much of the interior of the Christmas card. We get instead images of a pious young girl. And so here on the right, she is next to presumably her grandmother or an elderly woman, and she's praying. She's in this posture of prayer alongside the elderly woman. And so there's maybe some mentorship and some teaching going on here. So in this Christmas card, we're learning a lot about British culture and what Victorians thought about the value of Christmas and what the Christmas spirit might look like. We also get illustrations of motherhood and sisterhood. And so we get this idea that Christmas maybe meant more of like family. It meant more about purity and innocence and childhood. These are the values that this Christmas card is trying to get across to whoever the recipient was. So all of these illustrations, all of the material aspects of this Christmas card kind of interject themselves into the poem. And if you've ever read We Are Seven in school, you can kind of imagine like this setting of We Are Seven in this Christmas card format is very different from the setting of We Are Seven that you might get in the classroom in a normal school textbook. So the images kind of shade our reading of the poem. Here, the image takes up the majority of the page, that it overwhelms the text almost. On the right, towards the end of the poem, you kind of get finally like a Christmassy illustration with the snow-covered cottage. But really, Wordsworth's text is kind of set in relief against this backdrop of the illustrations. And it really does kind of change the meaning of the poem in important ways. And that kind of relationship between the materiality of the text and the text itself is what I got interested in as it pertains to Victorian culture. If we compare that Christmas card to two chapbook versions of We Are Seven that were published in the 1820s and 1830s, you now see We Are Seven in an entirely different format. Just for scale, these chapbooks are maybe like 3 inches by 2 inches. They're very tiny. And they were circulated as street literature for younger readers, for working class readers, lower class, semi-literate folks. And other scholars have kind of argued that these chapbook versions are kind of antidotes to vulgar street literature. So this moralistic poem about an innocent cottage girl who loves her family dearly and is loyal to them, that kind of moral message is meant to kind of counteract some of the immoral messaging in other kinds of street literature. So neither of these examples are devotional literature, but there's still kind of religious elements to them. And I just wanted to kind of point out how the paratext, how the materiality that surrounds the poem really inflects the meaning and the reader's interpretation of the work. all of this kind of pertains to my investigation of devotional literature. And so as I visited Wilson Library and looked at devotional poetry anthologies, I was interested in how the material and commercial aspects of these text objects reflects and reinforces kind of the identity of the evangelical reading community in the Victorian period. And evangelicalism in the Victorian period transcended denominations. So there were evangelical Anglicans, the dissenting traditions had evangelicalism kind of permeating throughout. So this is very much a trans-denominational reading community. So in this kind of mirroring that's going on, I think the evangelical reading community reinterpreted Wordsworth. They repurposed his poetry that had been circulating for decades, since the early 19th century. So as I visited Wilson, I employed a couple different methodologies. I first wanted to read Wordsworth's poetry alongside other poetry that was being anthologized in devotional anthologies. So how does Wordsworth's poem, are there emerging themes between Wordsworth's poem and another anthologized poem right next to it? I also wanted to consider Wordsworth's anthologized poetry as second-hand poetry. And this is a term that I'm kind of developing. And if you have thoughts about this kind of term, please let me know in the Q&A. But how have the hands of editors, anthologists, publishers, and readers kind of renovated and remediated Wordsworth's poetry for a new reading constituency? So much like if you enjoy consignment store shopping for clothes or furniture, or if you've ever had like kind of clothes passed down to you from older siblings, that kind of dynamic happens with poetry anthologies, where Wordsworth published a poem in the early 19th century and it kind of gets handed down through anthologies to new readers. And so it kind of is repurposed in that way. The strategies employed to anthologize Wordsworth, I think, reflect cultural attitudes, habits, and beliefs of the intended reading constituency. And all of this kind of allows us to construct an image of a devotional Wordsworth. And this in turn helps us to rethink and critique the Wordsworth that we've inherited in the 21st century academy. So our anthologies that we use in university classrooms today that contain Wordsworth's poetry are obviously very different from some of the devotional poetry anthologies that I looked at during my time as a Haynes Fellow. These are just four of many more devotional anthologies that I examined: the Evergreen, the Pious Minstrel, Sacred Harmony, Cottage Readings and Poetry. I included my hand in this slide, not just because I wanted to be a hand model. I wanted to kind of give a sense of scale for how small and portable these anthologies are. And I think that's done intentionally by the publisher. These books were, I think, meant to be portable, and they were meant to be read indoors. They were meant to be read out of doors, take it to the garden to read, take it on the train once that became a popular mode of transportation. These were texts that were meant to be carried by people throughout their daily walk. And a lot of the poetic contents within reflect that theme. There's lots of poetry about the outdoors and nature. There's poetry about, animals and creation. But there's also poetry about very specific topics, and I'll get into that. And Wordsworth's poetry does a lot of different things in these texts. So here's another, this is the Evergreen, one of the earliest devotional poetry anthologies. And it's published by James Montgomery, who was a prolific Christian religious publisher. He was also an evangelist in general. He was the son of Moravian missionaries. And he kind of used his business savvy and his faith to just publish tons and tons of devotional literature during his lifetime. And he was also a prolific poet. In this early edition, we find Wordsworth's poem Ode to Duty anthologized alongside poems by Heber and by Robert Pollock, Marianne Brown, poets that we don't typically study anymore. And that was to me one of the most interesting things is what we consider the most important poets of the 19th century may not necessarily have been the most important poets to your average devotional reader in the 19th century. They kind of had their own set of their own poetic canon, if you will. And really, the poems that they read by Wordsworth are very different poems from what we study today. We don't get a lot of Tintern Abbey in devotional literature in the 19th century, but we do get a lot of poems like Ode to Duty. There were over 10 editions of the Evergreen published throughout the 19th century, some edited by James Montgomery, others not. But Ode to Duty is consistently included in the contents of this poetry anthology, while other contents shift over time. The title of the anthology, The Evergreen, is selected because, as one of the prefaces explains, these are poems that kind of are evergreen. They withstand the test of time. They have edified believers of many generations, and they kind of withstand the test of time. And we can kind of see here on this edition, there's evergreen branches on the cover. So again, the materiality reflects the theme of the anthology. An Ode to Duty, Wordsworth's poem, is repurposed as a devotional poem. And without getting into too much of the minutiae, Ode to Duty, when Wordsworth wrote it in 1807, was not a devotional poem. Wordsworth was writing about his maturation as a poet, and his kind of evolution beyond being just a poet who writes about the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions. He's now wanting to evolve into a poet who senses his own duty. But in 1830, when James Montgomery anthologizes this poem, he uses it as a devotional poem that is talking about the Christian duty towards God and towards the Christian community. And so the lines and the language gets repurposed as having an evangelistic message. So this language about duty being a light to guide, a rod to check the erring and improving, has a lot of kind of similarities to the Christian view of duty. A later stanza really kind of sounds like Christian confession and penitence. So Wordsworth says, I, loving freedom, too blindly have reposed my trust. When my heart heard thy timely mandate, I deferred the task and smoother walks to stray, but thee I now would serve more strictly. So he's not talking about his relationship with Jesus Christ or anything, but readers in the Victorian period started to use this poem as a prayer poem to kind of pray to the Christian deity, to God and to Jesus. And the final stanza kind of is a form of absolution for the Victorian devotional reader. So they could kind of pray these words: I myself commend unto thy guidance from this hour. And in the light of truth, thy bondman let me live. So this kind of reads like a testimony and a sense of absolution for devotional readers. So that's just one instance of a devotional anthology repurposing Wordsworth. Another devotional anthology published a few years later, Sacred Harmony, takes different portions from Wordsworth's body of poetry and repurposes it as devotional poems. So here we get Support Under Affliction and Right of the Poor to Education. These are short excerpts from Wordsworth's The Excursion, which is a very long poetic composition. And so here, this anthology has essentially invented two new poems and given them new titles that Wordsworth never made up. And these excerpts are used to teach readers values about Christian activism at the time. So the Christian belief that the education should be for all, and that it's up to the Christian to support those suffering. These are kind of values that are taught through Wordsworth's poetry to Victorian readers. Another anthology, Cottage Readings and Poetry, published a couple decades later, is not very pretty to look at. It's got a very plain cover. And my hypothesis is that this is because this anthology is intended for working class readers. This anthology was published by the Religious Tract Society, who by the 1860s they were still publishing tracts and pamphlets, but they were now publishing entire books. And they started to recycle secular literature and reframe it in kind of religious terms for a lay audience. And in this case, laborers. So you could imagine with this kind of portable format, with a malleable cover that could be stuffed in pockets or in a satchel of some sort, a reader during their 1 hour break during the day could pull out this anthology and read the laborer's noonday hymn and derive a little bit of comfort and a little bit of consolation. We also get an outdoor poem, To the Celandine, which is kind of a praise to nature. And it's, if a laborer is outdoors, they can kind of be in the environment, pray, have some peaceful moments meditating on this poem. And then we also get We Are Seven from that Christmas card. It's the same poem. It references a little cottage girl. And so hence, if they're titling the anthology Cottage Readings and Poetry, there's great parallelism there. So that might explain why this pious poem was selected out of all of the pious poetry that Wordsworth wrote. All right, just because I'm mindful of time, Wordsworth had a lot of different versions of him appear in the Victorian period. Here in this anthology, he is much more Anglican sounding, and he's got high church views. We can tell just by the titles of the poems: Places of Worship, Catechizing, New Churchyard, Old Abbeys. These are not about individual faith. These are about ecclesiastical institutions and ecumenical worship and liturgy. And these selections all come from Wordsworth's ecclesiastical sonnets. In 1863, these poems had just entered the public domain. And so anthologies like Wilmot's anthology could reprint these poems without getting permission. And again, the tone in this anthology is very much a high church Anglicanism. So the devotional Wordsworth in this context means something different than in other anthologies. It's a kind of a composite version. Last but not least, actually real quick, this is from within the contents of English sacred poetry. This is an illustration that corresponds to the sonnet Catechizing from Wordsworth's ecclesiastical sonnets. And this illustration perfectly encapsulates what maybe high church Anglicanism might have looked like. Very kind of serious postures. Women are at the forefront because Anglicanism was more and more becoming feminized in terms of the membership, and the man with the most kind of erect posture is older, so there's a lot of balding heads among the men in the audience. You have maybe a younger man with ruffled hair who looks very, very penitent. And so you get this illustration that corresponds to the sonnet that begins from little down to least, in due degree around the pastor gathered. They stood in a trembling, earnest company. Last anthology that I'll share with you is also equally cool. This is an American edition. Here, Wordsworth's sonnet is anthologized. It's entitled The Prayers I Make. And my kind of final point that I wanted to make here is Wordsworth is actually translating this sonnet. It's a 15th century sonnet that comes from a different religious tradition. Wordsworth translated it in the early 19th century, and it appears towards the end of the 19th century again as a devotional poem. And this anthology in their preface talks about the historical unity of Christianity, and they selected a Wordsworth poem that especially reflects that value. And so there's intentionality, I think, in the intellectuality of these anthologies. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Let me stop share, and I greatly look forward to any questions that you might have. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much, Huntley. Thank you very much, Eric. We're going to slide into our question and answer period. Just a reminder, you are welcome to put questions into the chat box. I'll be glad to read them, or if you're comfortable, feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask your question out loud. And again, we've got about 15 minutes left until the end of our time.
Eric, thank you for your presentation. I wonder if you could expand a little for us from what you found in your research. You showed us different Christian groups kind of changing Wordsworth's center of gravity, his devotional position. Could you expand a little? How much of that is, would you say, inherent in Wordsworth's poetry when it was firsthand instead of secondhand? Like, what are the boundaries that were already there to better understand how it's getting pulled in other directions?
Well, yeah, thank you for that question. I think Wordsworth's views do change over his career. Evangelicalism certainly kind of influenced the development of Romanticism in general. And so some of his early poetry kind of has that evangelical zeal to it as well. But the later Wordsworth grows more conservative, and he kind of there's more high church Anglicanism in his later works, which is why we see like ecclesiastical sonnets once that enters the public domain, and that can be kind of used in anthologies. The devotional Wordsworth, I guess, is not a stable figure, and I think we see that reflected in all of the various anthologizations of Wordsworth. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but
Well, thank you guys both for that really wonderful presentation. Eric, I really appreciated you starting off thinking about kind of the 19th century publishing market. One of the things that's true about Wordsworth is, in addition to living pretty far into the 19th century, and as you mentioned, being really invested in his own copyright, he was also a great reviser. So one of the things that is always interesting to think about is really which versions of especially his early poetry are getting reprinted when they're outside of his control. And I noticed, for example, in the chapbook images that you showed, that they both have an interpolated new first line that is variant between the two of them. And then one of the later examples, that chopping up of the excursion, there are some other kind of commercialized versions of that. I think Routledge came out with a version that's just the first section, and they gave it a new title, The Ruined Cottage, and published it as a Christmas gift annual. I think we have like 8 copies of it. But I just wonder, to what extent is the religious repackaging of Wordsworth distinct from or different from other types of repackaging that are happening in the Victorian period, not just to Wordsworth, but to, other figures like, for example, Robert Burns, who gets kind of turned into this sort of figure of Scottishness or things like that?
Yeah, and I think my dissertation is definitely interested in those transformations that happen in the Victorian period. I'm working on a chapter now about Byron, who actually does make appearances in these devotional collections, and it's bizarre because so much of his poetry would not be suitable, but religious publishers do grab these like little like fragments from Childe Harold's Pilgrimage and they can kind of twist it and marshal it into devotional literature. But yeah, like We Are Seven, what's interesting about those chapbook versions is you get that first line. Some versions will say Tim, some will say Jim. The 1798 Lyrical Ballads version says Jem, like Jem. And what's ironic about all of it is like Wordsworth didn't even write the first stanza. Coleridge actually wrote the first stanza of We Are Seven. Wordsworth couldn't think of how to begin the poem. He had the rest of the stanzas, and he asked his sister and Coleridge, like, how do I begin this thing? I need help framing it. And so Coleridge sat down and in like one sitting wrote that stanza, and it's an inside joke, like Jem is like one of their personal friends or something like that. And then Wordsworth, being the meticulous editor that he is, like a decade later, removed those 3 words, dear brother Jem. And so like the chapbooks, they use the 1798 version, and there's little differences there. Once the later version of We Are Seven is in the public domain, you kind of get the final version of We Are Seven reprinted. In general, what I've noticed is that devotional poetry anthologies borrow from general poetry anthologies in terms of their best practices. So a lot of these poetry anthologies that I've shown you today, they borrow from their secular predecessors, like some of the editions that you mentioned, I think probably influenced the way that religious publishers operated. Religious publishers were trying to use the market to find inroads to kind of move the hearts of readers. And so they were looking for famous poets like Wordsworth and Byron. Felicia Hemans is another one, looking for celebrities who were writing even vaguely religious poems to kind of grab new audiences. Thank you for that question.
I have a second question for Huntley Hughes. Huntley, thank you for your presentation. And my question goes back to the very first image you showed us, a cartoon that shows the cow of the North reaching across the fence. And I noticed a lot of your sources in the special collections you worked with started in the early 1920s in the kind of range of coverage that the materials were coming from. I wonder if in your research you came across anything about the relationship between these groups you looked at and like a Ku Klux Klan organization in the South. Mm-hmm. It struck me that there had been a wave, the second wave of Klan organization had happened right before the wave of organization you're talking about. And some of the rhetoric is very similar. The Northern interlopers interfering, and even the use of Christian rhetoric to kind of urge this unification, a communal unification that the Klan was advocating. But other parts seem very diametrically opposed, and a lot of Klan rhetoric was against labor unions. So I just wondered if you had come across anything about that in your research.
Well, the most of the rhetoric involving kind of Northern capitalists preying on, disenfranchised or vulnerable Southern workers was coming more from a mill organization because of the relationship of capital moving north with those particular relationships. The idea that your boss was not the end all be all of the process that was making you miserable, right? Because people oftentimes had these very personal relationships with their direct bosses, but rather there was this larger system of a flow of capital that was imbricated in the exploitation of these workers. In particular, I think it was easy for mill organizers to play on these antipathies that remained between the North and South, because to many workers' minds, the North was synonymous with someone who wasn't working, agriculturally or within the mill, right? There was this kind of idea of still the kind of carpetbagger type image, right? So that was maybe a more underhanded, less kind of workers of the world type image of organization, but one that made a certain amount of sense, I guess, for the mill folks. The opposite was true, I think, in regards to like the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, which was very much interested in a national and then eventually even global alliance of agricultural workers, right? They very much wanted to establish relationships with agricultural workers in the North and the Midwest as being exposed to the same kind of systems as part of the same larger problem. I think one of the reasons why the Southern Tenant Farmers Union was so significant was that they were able to overcome a lot of prejudices and boundaries between these groups of agricultural workers. For one, by reaching across the kind of Mason-Dixon line, but also, and more importantly, by being distinctly and inevitably, without exception, interracial in organization and dedicated to racial justice. The very first Southern Tenant Farmers Union meetings were between Black sharecroppers and white tenant farmers, were co-ran by white and Black preachers, were insistent on the importance of interracial and kind of transracial allyship in terms of the agricultural laborers. Extending not only also to Black workers, but to Mexican migrant workers as well. And it's worth noting that the same was true of the mills, but the mills being a more segregated form of labor approach that question a little bit less directly than the H.L. Mitchell and Howard Kester types. Does that answer your question? Thank you for that.
This may be a follow-up to that, but one of the things that was really great in your presentation, Huntley, was the in that section where you're talking about Toby, just showing the publications. And I'm assuming that given the time period and also the context in which some of these things were produced, that, you know, these groups are taking advantage of new kind of copying technologies that allow them to circulate in new ways, different kinds of communications using things outside of kind of a traditional letterpress, printing press, and mainstream publication outlets. So I'm just wondering, you know, have you, what were the kind of circulation numbers for some of the documents that you've been looking at? You may, I mean, or not like you have numbers off the top of your head, but just in kind of, especially given what you just characterized between scopes of audience, do you have a sense of like what kinds of publications and publication avenues were being pursued by these groups and how that affected the types of messaging they were able to do?
Yes, especially initially, they printed very little kind of material that was designed to last for a particularly long period of time. This came from letters. This came from really quickly produced, I guess you wouldn't call it a newspaper exactly, but maybe periodicals or pamphlets that were handed out that were oftentimes posted. For example, there was a large cotton pickers strike that was organized almost entirely by word of mouth. And then the night beforehand, you know, posters nailed into the walls all around so people would know that today the day had come if they hadn't gotten the word. So much of this had to be done in secret because of the really brutal crackdowns on the tenant farmers unions and on the complicity of the police and physically harassing and assaulting and kind of running off organizers and workers who worked with those organizers. So yes, the answer to your question is a lot of really, really cheaply produced, easy to distribute, and very, very approachable literature in combination with a large word of mouth presence, because you have to consider as well the lack of literacy amongst these groups. One of the biggest educational contributions of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union was to try to set up literacy schools to allow farmers the opportunity both to read this material and to be able to calculate their own wages when dealing with, especially with sharecroppers, with dealing with those who paid them. Even part of the Delta and Providence Farm initiative was a combination of agricultural work, education, and religious education, all being part of one kind of larger system of kind of worker liberation, I guess might be the right word.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that question, Liz. I hope that answers it.
Thank you all very much. We're actually at the end of our time. Unless there's one really quick question, I'll pause for a second. Well, Eric Bontempo, Huntley Hughes, thank you very much for excellent presentations. Thanks everyone for attending and for a fantastic conversation here at the very end. Invite all of our participants here to watch out for invitations for when the Wilson Library Research Forum returns in September of 2022. Everyone have a good rest of the afternoon, and let us know if you have any questions. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you all very much.